It's called Encountering Jesus, and we're on lesson 9. If you've got the workbook, it's entitled Friends and Enemies. There are 3 passages that are grouped together for this lesson. So, is that me?
No, that was me.
Okay.
Sorry. Oops.
So, I have a lot of passages in addition, a couple of others I'd like to get to, or hopefully we'll have time for it all. I tried to practice a little bit. I think we'll fit it. But we're going to read all 3 passages, and we'll kind of dive in. So we'll start with John 12, verse 1. "6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at the table. Mary therefore took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard, and anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of the disciples, he who was about to betray him, said, 'Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?' He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, and having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Jesus said, 'Leave her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For the poor you will always have with you, but you do not always have me.' When the large crowd of the Jews learned that Jesus was there, they came, not only on account of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to put Lazarus to death as well, because on account of him, many Jews were going away and believing in Jesus." Okay, our second passage, we're going to jump right into it, is in Matthew 26. Matthew 26, verse 6. "Now when Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came up to him with an alabaster flask of very expensive ointment, and she poured it on his head as he reclined at the table. And when the disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, 'Why this waste? For this could have been sold for a large sum and given to the poor.' But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, 'Why do you trouble the woman? For she has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. In pouring this ointment on my body, she has done it to prepare me for burial. Truly I say to you, wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her.'" And then our third passage is in Mark 14. Mark 14, verse 3. Mark 14:3. "And while he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at the table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. And there were some who said to themselves indignantly, 'Why was this ointment wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor.' And they scolded her. But Jesus said, 'Leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. And truly I say to you, whenever the gospel is proclaimed in the world, what she has done will be told in memory of her.'" All right. So we read all 3 passages. And while there are some minor differences, it is reasonable to conclude that these 3 accounts, these are all describing the same thing. All right. Some of the differences that you may have noticed would be John specifically notes that Mary's anointing Jesus' feet, while Matthew and Mark say it was poured over her head. Of course, Matthew then goes on to say anointing his body. And so, it's like, well, she had a whole pound of it, which was a whole lot. So perhaps she started at the head and then ended with his feet, as John described. So just kind of fleshing that out, for our critical readers, you might notice these differences. So usually when we've been breaking down these texts that we've been, we out of batteries, or is it off? It is off. Okay, it's on. There we go. It's never off. Okay, so usually we break down the passage looking at the setting first. And in John, he tells us when this happens. If you look at the first verse, what does it say? 6 days before the Passover, right? And then John will go on, if you keep looking through, this is happening right before the triumphal entry, right before the end of Jesus' life. And John is considered to be chronological, as far as the sources I have available have, and it seems to, when I read it, it makes sense, that it would be chronological. When you look at, if you were digging into the synoptics, sometimes it may appear that, well, they placed this 2 days before the Passover, but I think that they introduce it parenthetically to present Judas and his motive. So they're not strictly sticking with the chronology. So anyway, just going to throw all that out there so you have that information. But that's not really the heart of what we're going to get at tonight. So the when was 6 days before the Passover, before the triumphal entry, as far as we can tell. And it was most likely on Saturday evening after sunset. So, in the way the Jews track their days, the day ends when the sun goes down. And, our day ends at midnight, right? So their Sabbath had just ended, and it's dinner on the first day of the week. And that may or may not be significant. I mean, you think about the Sabbath, the day of solemn rest, where they're focused on God, and then this dinner. Okay. All right. It does change maybe how you look at it a little bit, or help paint a more complete picture. So that gives us the when, and then the where is easy, because I think it's easy. Yeah, it tells you very clearly. It's in Bethany. All three of them say that. 2 of them say at the house of Simon the leper. So we're good. We know it's at Simon's house, Simon the leper in Bethany. And specifically, this is happening at his table, because he's hosting a dinner, right, for Jesus with friends. That takes us to the who. All right, I used the same picture from last week. Last week we did the woman who loved much, which I believe that, as far as I can tell, that's a different story, the sinner. But the 2 women did something very similar, didn't they? Same picture. This picture works for both, as far as I can tell. Anywho, but so we have Jesus, obviously, the people involved. We have, where was it again? At Simon the leper's house. So Simon was there, most likely, right? He's hosting. Okay. And who else is there? Who else y'all pick out of the text? The disciples, Mary, Martha, Judas, Lazarus. That's pretty good, yeah. Okay. And then at the end of John, it does talk about a crowd finding them. But I don't know if they had left or if they're still there. But so eventually there's talk of a crowd, but they were not there for most of this, as far as we can tell, right? This says when the large crowd learned that Jesus was there, they came. So they weren't there at first, right? Okay. All right. So tonight's lesson, well, I'm kind of gonna go about our method, or our teaching differently. And the book kind of led me this direction. I've got like a resource workbook that guides me somewhat. So we're going to focus on each of the different people who were here or who are in this story and kind of extract lessons from them and from their encounters with Jesus and from this encounter, but we'll cover some of the previous ones too, because it sheds light on the current encounter. You look at things that happened before, right? So Simon the leper, as far as I know, he's never mentioned as Simon the leper anywhere else in the Bible. There are other Simons, but this is the only time I ever found a Simon the leper. But there's something about lepers, right? With the Jews. What is that? Can someone tell me what? They're unclean. Are people supposed to interact with lepers and have dinner with lepers? No. So Simon the leper is hosting a dinner. How does that work? All right. Yes, it's reasonable to conclude that most likely he's not a leper anymore, but he was a leper at some point. And now Jesus, as we read in, here we go. Jesus says, "Be clean" in Matthew 8 and Luke 5. It doesn't say Simon the leper, but others with leprosy. He may have been one of them, or one of many others. Not every healing was recorded. But anywho, it's a fair conclusion, if they're gathering at Simon the leper's house and Jesus is there. Otherwise, Jesus probably would have healed Simon too, right? Maybe. I don't know. Yes, sir.
Leprosy, as we think of it today, is not the leprosy that they spoke of at Jesus' time, because leprosy could be really any number of skin diseases. It could be something like a psoriasis or whatever. So anytime there was something that represented what could be a bad disease, they were,
Okay.
you're not with the party. You're out of here.
Right.
Until things clear up.
Okay. Well, thanks for that information. So, I mean, for Simon, I'm presuming, right? Because we're not given a lot of information. We're just told that he's a leper, right? But he may have also been forgiven his sins. We don't know. But we do know that he's hosting this dinner. And he invited Jesus, and he invited Mary, Lazarus, and Martha, and his disciples. So we know that. And other people invited Jesus too, but as we get through this lesson, this dinner seems to be a very special one. Well, I guess they're all special, but this one, these people are some of them very, very closely tied to Jesus, is what you'll see. And so anyway, I think that this meal very well have been a form of thanksgiving toward Jesus. One of the commentaries I read by Jim Shear says this dinner was given in Jesus' honor. That's what he thinks. Up to you what you want to think about that. But if so, we see yet another example of many, as we've studied, if any of this is true, then Simon's life was changed by Jesus, by his encounter. Yes, sir. So they gave a dinner for him there. That's right. So thank you. Yeah, you pointed out a detail that I overlooked. Yeah, it says, right, yeah, which happened in John 11. We're in John 12. Okay. Yeah, so it may have been connected with Lazarus' resurrection, just kind of like a celebration, right? But my point was that I would bet that Simon's life has been changed because of an previous encounter with Jesus, and his response is to honor Jesus. So we've seen that example. We saw it last week with the woman who loved much. Now, I'm not going to rattle off all the examples, but it's good to see these examples because they teach us and they can encourage us, teach us get us thinking about how should we be towards Jesus? What should we be trying to do? All right, let's move on. Lazarus. Okay, Marty had mentioned that Lazarus, and we read in the text, he was what? He was raised from the dead. So and people were looking for Lazarus. We read that at the end of John. So he's kind of like a celebrity, I think. Okay, he's someone who died and came back, and people are like, "Whoa, Lazarus, tell me about it." Like that really happened. What was it like? Like, wouldn't you want to talk to Lazarus? If you knew that had happened, you'd want to go find him and talk to him about it. And so as I mentioned, large crowds gathered not only to see and hear Jesus, but to see Lazarus. But I'd like to let's look at John 11. I'd like to read. We won't read it all because there's a lot there, but we're going to start at verse 1 and go through some chunks of it. So you need your Bible for this. It's not in the book. So John 11, and we'll start in verse 1. It's good to bring this back to your mind, this story. Now, we could spend a whole class on John 11. I've heard sermons preached on it. There's a lot of you can draw from this, and we won't have time for that. But we'll at least read it, and we'll talk a little bit about it. Okay, so John 11:1. Now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with her ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. So the sisters sent word to him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. But when Jesus heard this, he said, the sickness is not to end in death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by it. Now we're going to skip all the way to verse 17, just to get most of the narrative here. But Lazarus dies, and then in verse 17, Jesus arrives. So here we are, verse 17. So when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been dead in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. Martha, therefore, when she heard that Jesus was coming, went to meet him, but Mary stayed at the house. Martha then said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, Yes, Lord. I have believed that you are the Christ, the Son of God, even he who comes into the world. When she said this, she went away and she called Mary, her sister, saying secretly, the teacher is here and is calling for you. And when she heard it, she got up quickly and was coming to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha met him. Then the Jews who were with her in the house and consoling her, when they saw that Mary got up quickly and went out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Therefore, when Mary came where Jesus was, she saw him and fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and was troubled, and said, Where have you laid him? And they said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. So the Jews were saying, See how he loved him? But some of them said, Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind have kept this man also from dying? So Jesus, again, being deeply moved within, came to the tomb. Now it was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. And Jesus said, Remove the stone. Martha and the sister of the deceased said to him, Lord, by this time there will be a stench, for he has been dead 4 days. Jesus said to her, Did I not say to you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they removed the stone. Then Jesus raised his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me. But because of the people standing around, I said it so they may believe that you sent me." When he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth." The man who had died came forth, bound hand and foot with wrappings, and his face was wrapped around with a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Therefore many of the Jews who came to Mary and saw what he had done believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them the things which Jesus had done. And we'll stop there. So there's the story. I did leave out that Jesus delayed coming. Like, we skipped that, and I didn't mention it, but 4 days had passed, and that was pretty much, as far as I can tell, intentional on Jesus' part, but that's not the point I want to get at. I'm going to make sure you have that information. So the high points of that story with the death and resurrection of Lazarus, he was sick. It does say, I think this is an important little detail, Jesus loved Martha and Mary, her sister, and Lazarus. And then after 4 days, Jesus arrives. Martha says, "If you had been there, my brother would not have died." She's sad, of course, grieving, right? And then Jesus says this huge statement, "I'm the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live even if he dies, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die." And Martha confesses Jesus as the Christ. Like, this is a big moment, right? Like, and there's so much happening. There's the weeping, the sadness of losing Lazarus, but then there's this conversation. There's Jesus. There's Martha confessing Jesus as the Christ. Then she goes to Mary, and Mary falls at his feet. Interesting detail. And says the same thing Martha says, basically, right? And we see twice it talks about Jesus being deeply moved in spirit, and he wept out of sympathy because he knew he was going to raise him, but he saw the pain of Martha and Mary, and he wept. And I think I couldn't pass it up. Is that not like the God who created the universe, like has emotion and cares about his people, and yes, and so anyway, when you are struggling and when you're weeping, yes, God has sympathy. He's with you. He feels with you. Anyway, okay, and then Lazarus come forth, and he does, right? And one interesting thing. Well, we'll get to it later. I don't want to. I skip ahead in my mind. Okay, and so I don't want to move on. To put a bow on Lazarus, he doesn't really do anything in this story. He's just there reclining at the table for our story today. But there's the history, right? And I imagine, if Lazarus was there and Jesus arrived, Lazarus there early maybe, Jesus arrives, I imagine Lazarus was overjoyed to see Jesus. Probably, would have been like, "Jesus, it's great to see you," give him a big hug, so just kind of thinking about, and also John 11 shows how special the relationship was between Lazarus and Jesus, as well as the two sisters. Okay, so speaking of sisters, we move on to Martha. Now, what comes to mind when you think of Martha? Most people, I think of the same thing. Okay, yes. So cleaning or serving, any other inputs? I don't want to talk the whole time, so I'm going to give it away. All right.
More of the practical in social rather than with the spiritual, but she is obviously spiritually minded as well. But people, that's what they remember her for.
All right. Okay. When I hear Martha, I always think of the Martha, Martha, oh, you're so busy, and distracted. But Mary has chosen. So that's in Luke 10. So let's go there. But that's what I think of. That was a very kind portrayal. And actually, I don't think you're wrong. I think we'll get there. Okay, so John 10, let's turn there. John 10:38. John 10:38. Oh, Luke 10:38. Thank you. I don't know why I'm saying John. Luke 10:38. Okay. So this is a shorter story. Now, as they were traveling along, he entered a village, and a woman came named Martha. A woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. And she had a sister called Mary who was seated at the Lord's feet listening to his word. But Martha was distracted with all her preparations. And she came up to him and said, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the serving alone? Then tell her to help me." But the Lord answered and said to her, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and bothered about so many things, but one thing is necessary, one thing's needful. For Mary has chosen the good part, or the good portion, which shall not be taken away from her." All right, and that's I think this is the first encounter Martha and Mary have had with Jesus, probably ever. I don't know. First one we read about. And Martha does what? Yep, but that's true. It starts with her inviting Jesus to her house, right? Yeah. But yeah, if we get right to the gist of the lesson, one of the core things Jesus is teaching here, he's what's he say? You're so worried and bothered about so many things, but he says one thing is necessary, for Mary has chosen the good part, which shall not be taken away. So what's he getting at there? What's Jesus saying? I have stuff, but I like to get y'all talking. Terry's hand is up. Okay.
Martha, the thing about Martha is that I know she's filled with, she needed to serve, to make sure the food gets served and everybody gets served.
Mm-hmm.
While Mary sat at Jesus' feet and was, making sure that she was leaning on his words. She was listening to his words while Martha went about. And going back to chapter 11, and also when it came to her, she as well as Mary they were grieving, and it took when Jesus confronted Martha, talking about when he was told to he told them to take the stone away. Martha forgotten, in the sense that Jesus has power over, even the body stinking for 4 days. When Lazarus was raised, he was completely risen. There was, and it was that type of situation with her that, when he did the deed, everybody was just amazed, except for the leaders. And in fact, that's what Jesus was troubled about, because being God, he would have foreseen what the leaders were fixing to do. And that may be part of the troubling of his spirit, apart from the way, he was fixing to be crucified some days later. So,
okay. All right, thank you, Terry. I'd like to move us forward because I'm behind where I thought I'd be at this point. I will entertain other comments, but I have found words of, I think it's Campbell Morgan. And I thought they were well written regarding Martha. he said, if we would be strong for service in the strength that prevents distraction and unrest, we must know what it is to find time amid all the duties of life to sit at his feet as disciples. And I guess what he's getting at is like, if you maybe you think it's a stretch, but I know my own experience. If I don't make time to sit at Jesus' feet, I don't make time in prayer to put my mind and put Jesus in the right place, put God in the right place, and put, then I can find myself serving resentfully, like I'm doing this, but I'm not happy, and versus, I could, or, and so there's something that can happen in the mind, or that does happen, where you can serve joyfully and happily and be glad to have the opportunity, or just be glad because Jesus has blessed you, and of what he's done for you. You'd be glad to serve whoever and do whatever needs to be done, and because the weight that's been lifted off of you and where you're going when this short life is over. But so I don't know. What I feel like is that's what Jesus was kind of pointing at, just kind of like the first things first. Mary. That's what you need, Martha. You got to sit. But I get it. If she wasn't serving, nobody would have been serving, and But there's kind of a mindset thing that I think changes perhaps with Martha over time. As it was mentioned, Martha has done many things well. She invited Jesus into the house. She served, and then later on in John 11, as Terry was getting at, she hears Jesus and she confesses that he's the Messiah, and says, I believe. But then she also, Jesus says, remove the stone, and there's a measure of faith there, had enough faith to believe that okay, well, Jesus said to do this. I know who he is. I'm going to do it, even though it's been 4 days, and I wouldn't normally want to do that. So anyway, you see, I guess, kind of a progression there in Martha. And then we finally arrive at John 12, and all it says is Martha served. But I'd like to think that this time around, as she served, she was different. Think about all the things that have happened, and what can we take out of that? When you serve, because just because you're serving doesn't mean it's, I don't know. It can be a challenge. I get it, but trying to keep the contentment and keep the reason for your serving in your mind, I guess, is the challenge. But that's where I'm trying to drive everybody with this, with Martha here. So, at Simon's dinner, it doesn't mention any resentment or distraction. Yeah, I wrote down maybe serving with a new outlook and a new mindset. She knows what the good portion is now. Okay, let's move along. So, disciples and Judas, I grouped them together because the text kind of, Matthew says the disciples said, and John specifically calls Judas out. So in Matthew, it says the disciples were upset and indignant at Mary's use of the ointment, considering it a waste, right? But when we get to John, I like that, there's more depth when we start thinking about Judas, because there's now, there's other things revealed now, right? So, speaking of why did Judas speak up against Mary's use of the ointment? Well, it tells us why, but so I guess the question shouldn't be there, but why? The obvious one. He's a thief. What'd you say? Yeah, he wanted it for himself, right? So when he saw her using that, he saw his money slipping away, potential money. So I think we could say in this instance, we see Mary sacrificially and extravagantly honoring Jesus, but Judas is only thinking about grasping and gaining. And so he's a slave to his money and possessions. You know, we read about you can't serve two masters. That's actually, I've got it here, Matthew 6 in the Sermon on the Mount. No one can serve two masters, for he will hate, the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. And then actually Timothy had mentioned in one of our previous lessons, 1 Timothy 6, 9, and 10. Our Timothy mentioned it, but anyway, not trying to confuse you. Timothy over there reminded us of this scripture. But those who want to get rich and fall into temptation, but those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare, and many foolish and harmful desires, which plunge man into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil, and some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. And we talked about this concept with the rich young ruler, because he struggled with the love of his money. And we see this in Judas too. And like we said in that lesson, we must be careful, right? It's easy to fall prey to this, to love your stuff and your money more than you love the Lord. And you see where that takes Judas, because he betrays Jesus, and it's a dark road for Judas with money as his master. So that's all I have for Judas. Judas is the enemy in this one. It says friends and enemies. I guess that wasn't explained to me, but I'm assuming that's where the title of the lesson came from. I didn't make it up. But anyway, let's get to our last person. Oh, okay, good. I think we'll be fine. Mary, save the best for last. Well, maybe. Martha was a pretty good story. So, Mary, what do you know about Mary based on what we've read or previous knowledge? We fleshed it out pretty well. Okay, sister of Lazarus and Martha. Okay. And what do you see Mary doing in the first, in that Luke 10 account? When Martha's serving and resentful. What's Mary doing? She's sitting at the feet and listening to his teaching. And, he says, I've repeated this, one thing is necessary. It seems over and over again that Mary has a pretty keen sense of what is important, especially when we look at today's text. And you look at that text, perhaps. That's what the scriptures bring to light. I'm blocking my microphone. Sorry about that. So another obvious question. Someone shouted out, what did Mary bring to the dinner in John 12 in today's text? Costly ointment, yes. Let's see here. I've got it written down, but it's not on the board for all three accounts. So it says pure nard, a pound of expensive ointment or perfume. In Matthew, an alabaster flask of very expensive ointment. Mark, an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly. So those are the descriptions of what she brought. Now, spikenard is an Asiatic plant, did I say that right? From which ointment was extracted. Okay, and it's often used to anoint kings, I've come to find out. And a pound of it was worth, they said, 300 denarii. The disciples are Judas. Judas said, right? Yeah, a denarius is 1 day's wage for an average laborer, so 300 is almost a whole year of wages. It's a lot of money. It's very valuable, I guess, right? And so Mary probably saved. She saved for some time to be able to purchase this, and then she used it on this special occasion, right? Very intentionally. And so she planned this out. So we see that Jesus had raised Mary's brother Lazarus, as we read and was mentioned. And so already this is special. That had just happened, and they're meeting for a dinner. But then also, she may have sensed that Jesus' death was coming. She might have picked up on it. Jesus was not hiding that. Like, he said it over and over again, had mentioned it multiple times before this passage where he talks about his anointing for burial. And so maybe she put two and two together, and she's like, this might be my last opportunity, to really honor Jesus, do something good for him. And so she took it. And so, Jesus defends her. Let's see. Yeah, I have the question up there with the anointing. I'm going to move us quickly here. Do we get the takeaways? He says, she's done a beautiful thing to me. And preparation for the burial, right? So, obviously, oh, wait. Sorry, I'm like back and forth. It's easy to get out of order here. John notes specifically that Mary anoints his feet and that wipes his feet with her hair. And, we didn't go in detail about the fact that that's a very humble and like a servant way of acting. You're honoring him. You brought this expensive thing, but you're on your knees. You're using your own hair to clean feet, right? So it shows humility and submission. Wanted to bring that to light. And every single time we've seen Mary in these three passages we read, where was she? She was at his feet. She fell to his feet in John 11. She was listening to him teach in the Luke passage, and then in John 12, she's at his feet again. And I just think that's significant. She obviously has a deep love and affection for Jesus, listening to his words and extravagantly honoring him. And she gave him the best she had. Whoa, Mary. Right? Like, this is special. Okay? So I'm just trying to paint that picture. So John mentions also the house is filled with fragrance of the oil. I think that's interesting just because, like, I don't know if y'all have noticed, but like how like smells bring back memories. I bet he smelled spikenard later on sometime. I was like, I remember that dinner, that we had with Jesus. But that takes us to our takeaways. Jet through this. We have 2 minutes. We need to spend time with Jesus. That's one of my takeaways. Okay, so I got a weird look from Brian here. But what I mean is spend time with the Lord and spend time with Jesus, reading about Jesus. Spend time in his word, which is what you're doing tonight. But what each of the people here, we have Simon, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, they seize the opportunity to spend time with Jesus. And we need to seek him. But I was just thinking a lot about, especially in prayer, like seeking the Lord, and how valuable that is, and how important that is, and making time for it. Make time to pray to him in private. Just you. It's easy to feel like you're too busy. Martha was busy serving. Too busy, right? So that's a different passage, but I'm drawing it in. We should honor Jesus, right? Yes. Now he's not here, so you can't dump spikenard on him, do what Mary did. How are you going to do that? Got 1 minute, but wish I had more minutes, because some of you might give me some better ideas than I think of. I always think of just telling others about what he's done for you. You should. Telling others about him.
Gave up something of great value, as well as set aside
Gave up something of great value and set aside the ordinary duties of the day to spend time with him.
related. He's done
Mhm.
Later, have I wonder if the next day Martha had to get up and make another meal. Well, of course she did. Those are things
Right.
they don't, but these were one-time opportunities, both of them.
Yes, and that was my last one. So obviously we got to love God and people, not money. Well, love God first, and then he says love people, so we love people. But then time is short and opportunities are still limited. And some opportunities have short windows, and you only have so much time that you could have acted to do something. Let's take advantage of them. Yeah. Anywho, that is all for tonight. Our next lesson is actually going to be lesson 12 for those of you preparing, and then we'll backtrack. But Justin's going to lead us with Thomas on lesson 12 on next Wednesday. So thank you.